Good afternoon and welcome to today's Center for Ag Profitability webinar here at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. I'm Brad Lubben, Associate Professor and Extension Policy Specialist here in the department and with the center. And I'm pleased to welcome you to today's webinar focused on farm program directions, details, and decisions. Just a reminder, this is our weekly webinar series, generally held every Thursday at noon. You can always find an updated schedule of upcoming webinars, the ability to register for those, as well as an archive of past webinars, including this one that will be posted soon after it's complete. You can always find those webinars at cap.unl.edu. Just search for the webinar link in the banner up atop. As I said, today's program is on farm program directions, details, and decisions. We're pleased to work with USDA's Farm Service Agency here in Nebraska on the content. The 2018 Farm Bill was extended for another year. A new Farm Bill was not completed last year, so we have what seems to be a simple extension of current legislation for one more year. But the simple extension of current legislation doesn't just mean a simple new decision between agriculture risk coverage and price loss coverage. It means that producers face a new decision, but perhaps under changing economic conditions and considerations. And so we're going to spend some time focusing on the economics, the prices, the underlying support levels for ARC and PLC in 2024, and the considerations that producers might have as they go to FSA to make a decision. We're going to welcome Dillon Breinig, Production Compliance Program Specialist at FSA, to discuss farm program decision details in 2024 and procedures for producers. He'll give an overview of the ARC and PLC details. I'll come back with a discussion of some of the economics and projections, and then we'll take some Q&A from the audience as we go. If you have questions as we go, please look at the Q&A feature on Zoom to submit that question. The chat feature works as well, but preferably Q&A. So with that, I'm going to welcome you, Dillon. Thank you for joining us today. I'll ask you to go ahead and share your presentation, and we'll make sure it's up and running.
Awesome. Thank you, Brad.
There we are, Dillon. Go ahead.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Brad. I appreciate it. So first and foremost, I know Brad kind of already introduced myself, but I'd like to introduce myself as Dillon Breining. I'm a program specialist in the Production and Compliance Department with the Nebraska State Office. I joined the Nebraska FSA State Office in October of 2023. So I'm going to kick off our webinar here and go over some policy and procedure for the ARC PLC programs. So we'll go ahead and get started. The topics I'm going to discuss today are going to essentially be the basics of each program, some examples of some payments, and also some deadline information that's important for you all to be aware of. So the ARC PLC election and enrollment period for 2024 is open now. The continuing resolution, as Brad stated, was passed on November 16th. That included an extension of the 2018 Farm Bill, which included the authorization of ARC PLC for 2024. The sign-up began on December 18th, and it will run through March 15th of 2024. Some general reminders for ARC PLC. A lot of this information is the same as it was in prior years. Both ARC County and PLC may be elected on a crop-by-crop basis on the farm. For example, if a farm has both wheat and corn base, producers can elect PLC for the wheat base and elect ARC County for the corn base. If a producer is electing ARC individual, that election will apply to all covered commodities on the farm. Some additional reminders. It's important to note that if producers previously signed a multi-year contract, there is no action needed unless you want to make an election change or unless something has changed on the farm. In all cases, if you do not make an election for 2024, the election in place for the 2023 program year will roll over. Regardless if a new election is made, a new contract must be completed by the March 15th deadline. The election decision must be unanimous by all 2024 producers on the farm. For FSA purposes, a producer is someone who has interest in the cropland on the farm. Landowners without a share of the cropland on the farm are not required to sign off on the program election. I think I skipped it here. Okay. So now we're going to look at the individual programs within ARC PLC, starting with the price loss coverage program. PLC is strictly a price protection program. Payments are triggered when the effective price for a crop year is less than the effective reference price. PLC program payments are issued after October 1 of the following year. As I stated before, PLC may be elected on a crop by crop basis on the farm. So these are the statutory reference prices that were set for the 2018 Farm Bill. These carry over for program year 2024, and they remain in place. I've highlighted some of the more common commodities that are grown in Nebraska for corn, grain, sorghum, soybeans, and wheat. And the prices for those, the reference prices for those commodities can be highlighted here. So moving on to the formula for the effective reference price. The effective reference price is the lesser of 115% of the reference price, or the greater of the reference price, or 85% of the 5-year Olympic average of the market year average price. I think it's important to note that this calculation allows for a higher effective reference price if historical market year average prices are trending higher. In past years, the effective reference price has been equal to the crop's reference price. As we will go over on the next slide, the effective reference price can be greater than the statutory reference price that was established under the Farm Bill. So now that we've covered how the effective reference price is established, next we're going to briefly review the effective reference prices for 2024. The report I'm showing on this slide are the effective reference prices for ARC PLC for program year 2024. You will notice that the effective reference price for oats, corn, grain, sorghum, and soybeans, along with a few other crops, will be higher than the statutory reference prices that were established in the Farm Bill. Specifically looking at the more common commodities grown in Nebraska, the effective reference price for corn is $4.01. Soybeans is $9.26. Grain sorghum is $4.06. And the effective reference price for wheat remains at $5.50, which is the same as the statutory reference price. Later on, I will kind of explain how these effective reference prices affect the ARC PLC programs. So before we start looking at the payment formulas for each program, I wanted to first cover the PLC effective price, the effective price, and the market year average price. The PLC effective price represents the price received for a crop in a specific year. The PLC effective price is compared to the effective reference price to determine if there's a price loss that ultimately determines if a PLC payment is triggered. The effective price is simply the higher of the market year average price or the national loan rate. Most generally in prior years, the market year average price has been used. So as a reminder, this is what our payment formula for the price loss coverage program looks like. Just as a note, in 2022 for our larger commodities, and I'm referencing corn, soybeans, grain, sorghum, and wheat, there were no PLC program payments for 2022. And if there were payments, those would have been issued in October of 2023. So once we have determined if a PLC payment rate is triggered, we then look at the farm level payment formula to determine if a PLC payment, to determine the PLC payment on the farm. First, we take a look at the PLC payment rate, and multiply that times the farm level PLC yield times the payment acres. The PLC payment acres are determined by multiplying the commodity's total base acres on the farm times 85%. The PLC yield is the farm level established on the farm. It's important to remember that the PLC payments are not dependent on the planting of a crop on the farm. So next, we're going to review a quick example moving through the entire process of a PLC payment. Keep in mind, this is just an example using a hypothetical effective price, but using the actual effective reference price for corn in program year 2024. So first we look at the effective reference price that's already established for 2024, which is $4.01 for corn. We look at the effective price is $3.57. The effective price is lesser than the effective reference price, which gives us a PLC payment rate for corn of 44 cents per bushel. In this example, farm 100, we have 425 acres of corn base with a PLC yield on the farm of 165. We take the total base acres on the farm times 85%, which gives us our payment acres. We take that times the PLC yield on the farm of 165 times the 44-cent PLC payment rate, which gives us a total corn PLC payment rate in this example of $26,227. So now we're going to move on to ARC County. ARC County is an income support income support program based on benchmark or expected county level crop revenue. The benchmark revenue is guaranteed at 86%. The ARC County program uses county level yields and national average prices to determine the benchmark and actual revenues by crop. ARC County payments for a crop are triggered when the actual county revenue falls below the 86% guarantee. For ARC County, revenue losses are determined for a crop independent of other crops on the farm. Similar to PLC, the covered commodity crop does not have to be planted on the farm, and payments are issued at 85% of the farm's base acres, which is similar to PLC, which is the same as PLC. And it's important to note that producers are not required to report production to FSA. With ARC County, first we're going to look at the benchmark revenue or expected revenue. The benchmark revenue uses an Olympic average method where both the yield and price look at the 5 years prior to the preceding year of the program year. For example, for program year 2024, the benchmark period will use price and yield data from 2018 through 2022. The high and low figures are dropped from the Olympic average calculation for both yield and price. The 5-year Olympic county average yield uses RMA data if it's available. If RMA data is not available for the specific crop, NAS data is then used. A substitute yield could be applicable if the county yield in the benchmark year is below 80% of the county T yield. The 5-year Olympic average national price is determined by using the higher of the market year average price or the effective reference price. And this is important. It's important to note that the current year effective reference price is used in any year in the benchmark period where the effective reference price is higher than the market year average price. Again, this is important because the effective reference prices from slide 10 could become a factor in the benchmark year period for certain crops. So the final step in the ARC County process, if you will, is determining the actual revenue. The county level actual revenue for a crop is determined by multiplying the actual average county yield for the crop times the higher of the market year average price or the national loan rate. In most recent years, due to higher trending commodity prices, the market year average price has typically been used. Similar to the benchmark revenue, the actual revenue uses RMA or NAS as a source of the county average yield for the yield data. So moving on, we're going to take a look at the ARC County producer payment example. Once the actual average county yield is determined for the crop, along with the market year average price, or the national loan rate, whichever one is higher, then the crop revenue is calculated. In this example, the market year average price is higher than the national loan rate, therefore the market year average price is used. In this example, corn is the commodity, or the base acres on the farm are corn, and the actual average county yield is 135 bushels. So we take the county yield times the market year average price, which gives us an ARC County actual crop revenue of $513 per acre. Next, we're going to look at the guarantee revenue and the actual crop revenue to determine if there was a crop revenue loss. The ARC County actual crop revenue is less than the guarantee, so we see a crop revenue loss of $18.39 per acre in this example. In this example, the calculated payment rate is less than the ARC County benchmark revenue cap of 10%. Therefore, the ARC County payment rate is $18.39 per acre. The ARC County payment cap is 10% of the benchmark revenue, and the benchmark revenue, or the guarantee, is 86% of the benchmark revenue. So next, we're going to look at the payment example as it applies to the farm once we've determined that a loss has occurred. So on this farm, we have corn, or we have 100 corn base acres. We take those 100 base acres times 85%, which gives us payment acres of 85, times the producer's share on the contract of 100%, times the crop loss, which is $18.39 per acre, which gives us the producer payment of $1,563. I will also note that the producers on the farm would be eligible for ARC County payment on corn because there was a revenue loss on corn in this county. This is true regardless of whether or not corn was actually planted on the farm. So some additional information on ARC County. ARC County also uses criteria for using separate irrigated and non-irrigated yields to determine revenues and payment rates. ARC County irrigated and non-irrigated revenues and payment rates are determined on a crop by crop basis, and counties and crops that do not qualify will use a blended county average yield between irrigated and non-irrigated production. So these are more commonly known as HIP, or a HIP county, and that stands for historical irrigated percentage. A HIP will be determined for applicable crops on each farm in the county using FSA irrigated and non-irrigated acreage report data from 2013 through 2017. The HIP factor is used to determine the number of base acres used in calculating both the irrigated revenue and the non-irrigated revenue. And the HIP factor that's applicable to the farm remains on the farm for 2019 through 2024. So under the 2018 Farm Bill, ARC County also uses a physical location criteria. So ARC County revenues will also be calculated based on the farm's physical location as determined by each tract associated with the farm. ARC County benchmark revenues, guarantees, and actual revenues are based on the physical location of each tract on the farm, and therefore gives us a weighted, and those are weighted by the base acres associated with each tract, and then are summarized to the farm level for one ARC County payment rate for the covered commodity on the farm. So our last program, the final program option that I'm going to discuss today is ARC Individual. ARC Individual is considered a whole farm revenue coverage option that is unique in its own way because the revenues are weighted for all covered crops that are planted to determine the farm's overall gains and losses. So as reflected on this slide, ARC individual is unique because the farm elected and enrolled an ARC individual must have at least 1/100th of an acre planted to a covered commodity to determine revenue gains and or losses. So there is one exception with ARC individual in the planting criteria. The one exception is farms where all covered commodities are 100% approved prevent planting are still considered eligible for potential ARC individual benefits. If a revenue loss occurs, ARC individual payments, if a revenue loss occurs, ARC individual payments are issued on 65% of the farm's base acres. Along with a planting requirement, ARC individual also requires production to be reported to FSA. So as I referenced before, ARC individual provides income support to producers who plant any of the 22 covered commodities, regardless of whether base acres exist on the farm for that commodity. Producers on an ARC enrolled farm who do not share in the farm's planted covered commodities are ineligible for ARC IC payments. Producers who do not have a share of covered commodities on an ARC IC farm, but do not timely enroll, are also ineligible for ARC IC individual payments. FSA will also compute benchmark revenues for each covered commodity that is planted in the current year. So another big difference between ARC County and PLC compared to the ARC IC program is the production reporting requirement. Production on a farm enrolled in ARC IC is required to be reported by July 15th in the year following the crop year. For example, if a producer elects to enroll a farm in ARC IC for program year 2024, the covered commodity production that was planted on the farm must be reported to FSA by July 15th of 2025. As I discussed before, prevented plant acres are only included in cases where 100% of the farm's initial planted covered commodities are approved prevent plant. To establish benchmark revenues, producers must also certify production for the benchmark period as well. Therefore, it falls in line with the production reporting requirement for ARC IC. ARC individual yields are certified as a blended yield to include production from both irrigated and non-irrigated acres. In addition to the irrigation practice, ARC IC yields must include production from all ARC IC eligible types of the covered commodity planted. Production from covered commodity acres that are hay, graze, etc., they must have a conversion factor applied to determine the production. It's important to remember that regardless of what type or how many acres of covered commodities are planted, ARC individual payment acres are 65% of the total base acres on the farm. As I mentioned before, make sure I'm on the right slide here. As I mentioned before, ARC individual payments are triggered when the current year revenue from all planted covered commodities on the producer's ARC IC farm falls below the guarantee revenue for the ARC IC farm. Another important item to take note of is that an ARC individual farm is defined as the producer's share of all planted covered commodities from all ARC IC farms enrolled in the state. So crop insurance indemnities and farms not enrolled in ARC IC are not included in the revenue calculation. It's also important to note that additionally, that it's important to note that revenue from one crop or another farm enrolled in ARC IC could potentially eliminate the revenue loss from another farm or another crop. So each producer on the ARC IC farm will have a unique benchmark revenue calculated across all planted covered commodities based on their share of all ARC IC enrolled farms in the state. For example, a landowner or operator could have multiple farms enrolled in ARC IC and have a different share percentage of planted covered commodities across those farms, therefore impacting both the benchmark revenue and actual revenue. So I'm going to quickly move through an ARC IC example. So here's where we need to determine a weighted benchmark revenue because both wheat and barley were planted on the farm. The percentage of planted covered commodities is calculated by taking the planted commodity acres divided by the total planted covered commodities. The benchmark revenue for each crop has been determined in this example. We then take that figure and multiply times the percent of planted covered commodities to reach our weighted farm benchmark revenue of $270.58. Again, similar to ARC County, ARC IC benchmark revenue is 86%, is guaranteed at 86%. So now that we've established our weighted benchmark and guarantee revenue per acre, we're going to calculate the producer's actual revenue loss. The producer has certified that his actual yield for wheat was 35 bushels per acre and his barley yield was 48. The market year average price is higher than the national loan rate, so the market year average price is used. We take the yield times the price times the number of acres planted to determine our actual crop revenue for each commodity, which gives us a total crop revenue on the farm of $314,480. Simple math to break this down to revenue per acre, we take that figure divided by the total acres planted, which gives us a weighted average revenue per acre. Since this producer has 100% share of the covered commodities planted on the farm, the producer's average revenue per acre is the same as the weighted average revenue per acre. So from here, we can identify that the producer had a loss. We take the weighted guarantee calculated on the previous slide, minus the producer's average revenue per acre, which gives us a loss of $36.15 per acre. The 10% ARC IC benchmark revenue cap of $27.06 would be the payment rate in this example because it is lesser than the producer's actual loss per acre. So moving on to the ARC IC payment calculations for the farm, remember that ARC IC only pays on 65% of the base acres on the farm. So there are 750 base acres on this farm. We take that times 65%, which gives us the payment acres of 487.5. Again, the producer has 100% share of the covered commodities on the farm. So we take the payment acres times 100% times the ARC IC payment rate of $27.06, which gives us our ARC IC payment of $13,192 in this example for farm 225. Keep in mind that even though the producer did not plant corn or oats on this farm, the total base acres for all covered commodities are used in the payment formula. So that's a lot of information in a half an hour, but we have this table here as a simple breakdown of all the information that's a little easier to look at. But here's a quick reference guide with some key talking points about the ARC PLC programs that producers can consider when making an election. I'll just quickly note here, because I'm running out of time, I will quickly note that the ARC PLC program does include provisions for producers who plant fruits and vegetables. The planting of fruits and vegetables on payment acres enrolled in ARC and PLC program is permitted. However, if fruits and vegetables are planted on payment acres, an acre for acre reduction will apply, unless the fruit or vegetable crop is destroyed without benefit before harvest. As a quick recap, as I finish up here, I just wanted to remind producers that the ARC PLC election and enrollment deadline is March 15th of 2024. If no new election is made, the 2023 election will roll over for 2024. However, a new contract must be enrolled by the March 15th deadline. So, county offices are working on this process right now. So please give your local county office a call to make an appointment if you haven't already done so. So, in closing, here are some additional links where you can find more information about the ARC PLC program and other FSA programs that are available. I appreciate you all taking the time out of your day to join us here. If you have any questions for myself or a local county office employee, you can find that information here to contact us. So that's the end of my stuff, Brad. I will turn it over to you.
Dillon, thank you very much. Greatly appreciate your presentation to get things started today. I was just going to ask the question about reminding producers or remembering that enrollment, election and enrollment are two separate things, and that's exactly what you finished with there on that slide. So we'll come back to some questions here after we wrap up as well. I remind participants, please submit any questions you have as we go along. We'll hold them for the moment. I've got some material here to present, and then I will invite more questions, and I'll invite Dillon back for some discussion of those as well. So I believe I'm sharing my presentation here. I want to talk briefly about farm program details and decisions, talking about the economics of the decision, and perhaps a bit of an outlook for understanding the significance or the impacts that this year's decision might have. I start with the title slide here just to note, I have 4 colleagues around the state, extension economists, extension educators across the state, Jessica Groskopf, Jim Jansen, Anastasia Meyer, and Shannon Sand. Those 4 are located regionally around the state with an opportunity to help serve in local areas and local programming. The 5 of us jointly are working with USDA Farm Service Agency here in Nebraska to roll out some producer education following today's webinar. So we'll get to that as we go. If we talk about farm program decisions in 2024, I might frame it in 4 different bullets here. Just one to remember, there is a farm bill that's supposed to be developed. It didn't get done on 2023. It was a simple extension of 1 year. That's why we have the same programs, but a new decision here in 2024. The ARC PLC decision is an annual decision under the Farm Bill language. And so a simple extension means we also have a simple new decision here in 2024, along with expectations and discussions about whether a new Farm Bill will eventually come. But noting that we have a decision in 2024, it's worth a very brief look back at 2023 and recognizing 2023 program payments and cash flow expectations come in 2024, if at all. And that might impact your perspective of how significant this decision is or what it might mean. But yet the ARC versus PLC decision is a critical factor here based on the economics today. And that's the decision we want to look at. And then there are other factors to consider. ARC versus PLC is straightforward, except that it's a complex decision in its own right. And the ARC versus PLC decision that you make might also affect your choices in terms of crop insurance, or your choices in terms of your marketing and other risk management decisions on the farm. So it's a complicated decision, and it certainly does integrate with other choices you make on the farm. If we do look back briefly at the 2023 crop that was harvested this past fall, the marketing year isn't complete until well into 2024, so these numbers are not final. But if you project national marketing year average prices where they were currently projected as of late last year, $4.85 corn and grain sorghum, $12.90 soybeans, $7.30 wheat. If you compare that to where the effective reference price for those commodities was for 2023, then there is no doubt that there won't be a PLC payment on the 2023 crop to be paid here in 2024. Prices are high enough, even if we substantially fell off of those price expectations, we're a long ways away from triggering any sort of PLC payments. If you go over to the right-hand side there, how big a loss would it take to trigger an ARC payment? Well, the far right-hand column says it would take something like a 25 to 35% loss before we would trigger an ARC payment on the 2023 crop. It takes a big price loss or a big yield loss or a combination of the two relative to expectations. That is an expectation of current price projections and a simple naive expectation of average yields. We know we had below average yields in places. We know we had substantially below average yields in some counties with drought concerns. It's possible we will see ARC payments in some counties, but it's also likely to be limited. And so the expectations at least are somewhat muted here. Just because expectations of payments in 24 on the 23 crop might seem relatively small for ARC and PLC. It doesn't mean the decision in 2024 is muted or irrelevant as well. We look at the mathematics here and the economics of ARC and PLC. I start with PLC. Dillon discussed some of the mechanics here, so I won't repeat the language here, but just to know that there are equations that calculate how this works. The key equation is the fact that this year's reference price is not necessarily last year's reference price. As Dillon noted, the reference price is the higher of a statutory reference price or 85% of the 5-year Olympic average. And as it turns in 2024, for some of the major crops in Nebraska, for the first time, we have a 5-year Olympic average times 85% that is higher than the statutory reference prices. So let me look at corn in the first row as an example. The statutory reference price is $3.70. That was fixed in Farm Bill language. We look at the 5 most recent complete marketing years. 23 isn't yet complete, so we back up. That's 2018 through 2022. Those 5 prices are listed there. Those are the national marketing year average prices. The Olympic average takes out the high, takes out the low, averages the rest. And so I've crossed out the low, I've crossed out the high. The average of the rest is $4.71. 471 times 85% gets you 401. 401 is higher than 370, so we use the higher of. There is a max, as Dillon noted too, no more than 115% of 370. That's 426. Well, 401 is between 370 and 426, so we in fact use 401. And so we have, if you're thinking PLC math, we have a effective reference price for corn for PLC at 401 a bushel. Grain sorghum 406, soybeans 926, wheat still stuck at 550. We haven't had high enough prices for long enough years to get us off of that 550 legislated reference price for. So that's the PLC safety net where it effectively kicks in. If you put that on a graph, I would show it as the gold bar or the gold line represents the 5-year Olympic average. The dashed line represents 85% of. And for 2024, for the first time, that 85% of the 5-year Olympic average climbs above the fixed 370 reference price in the red line. It means we have a higher effective reference price in 2024. Projections looking ahead would say we might see even a higher reference price in the coming years as we work in the recent higher price years into the 5-year Olympic average. Projections also show prices declining. Well, that's a long run projection. That's not meant to be a market forecast on our part. It's a long run projection from some baseline projections available nationally. Just to note, the reference prices, the effective reference price does look like it would go up. It looks like it could be even higher next year, but recognize that's another decision a year from now, presuming we have the same programs continuing again. So the consideration here is to note that we in fact have a decision to make with higher reference prices. That's how PLC kicks in mathematically. Consider ARC. There's even more equations here back behind the scene, but the key equations at the top. We calculate a benchmark revenue for ARC. That's equal to a benchmark yield times a benchmark price. Multiply that benchmark revenue times 86%, and that's where the benchmark guarantee kicks in. Then you calculate revenue to count against it, then you calculate a payment rate and a payment accordingly. But if we consider that benchmark revenue and we consider that the guarantee is effectively 86% of the benchmark revenue, then let me illustrate how that might work for corn. As we noted for corn, the effective reference price for 2024 is 401. When we calculate a 5-year Olympic average to go into the benchmark price for ARC, we use the higher of the national marketing year average price or this effective reference price. Some math that I had done in previous years didn't acknowledge that it was an effective reference price instead of the reference price, but then 2024 is the first year that it actually matters for some of the major commodities. So I've got 2 numbers in there for 2018. That's a 361 was the national marketing year average price that year. 401 is this year's effective reference price. You throw out the low. So I threw out 361, I shaded it out. I've done that for every year in that 5-year series. Then I have 5 prices. Then I calculate an Olympic average. I threw out the low. That's one of the 401s. I threw out the high. That was 2022's 654. If you average the rest, that's 485. Now I've gone to an additional calculation that doesn't technically show up in the FSA equation, but if you take that Olympic average price of 485, that's the benchmark price. If you take that benchmark price times 86%, you get a calculation of 417. And my effective ARC price, as I've called it, is that ARC would kick in at 417 corn, presuming you hit average corn yields. So there's an effective price where it kicks in, presuming average yields or benchmark yield levels. ARC kicks in on low revenue, not just low price, but the price, the effective price here is a way to compare ARC and PLC in terms of a price component. So here's the graph that would show how that's calculated over time. The blue line in this case is the 5-year Olympic average calculated for ARC. The dashed line is 86% of that 5-year Olympic average. Now let me try and simplify that just a bit, get rid of some extraneous lines. If you've got a black line on this chart that shows price projections, you have the blue dashed line, which shows what I call the effective ARC price. And you have the red line, which shows the reference price, and as it moves higher, the effective reference price. In 2014, when producers first made an ARC versus PLC decision, you can see where the ARC protection kicked in relative to the PLC protection. And it wouldn't have surprised anybody that overwhelmingly producers chose ARC. In Nebraska, 96% of producers, corn acres, chose ARC. By 2019 and 2020, when we had the next decision, prices had fallen to the point that the ARC guarantee was lower than the PLC guarantee, and people overwhelmingly switched to PLC. It has been an annual decision since that time. I show in 2023, it was 51-49, just slightly preferred ARC. Well, we've had higher priced years. We've had years recently where neither ARC nor PLC have paid substantially, and a little bit more of a toss-up as to which one might protect. Where will we be in 2024? That's your decision to make as a producer. That's the corn outlook, or the corn price. The sorghum graph looks, frankly, a lot alike. We never chose ARC to the same high degree because the protection was, frankly, a little more closer to PLC to start with. We overwhelmingly switched to PLC when prices were lower. We're now roughly again in a 50-50 split, and 2024 remains a question. For soybeans, well, we had overwhelming support or overwhelming sign up again in the early years for ARC. 97% of Nebraska soybean base acres were enrolled in ARC in 2014. Well, the ARC protection levels were dramatically higher than the PLC protection levels at that time. We saw prices fall, which meant that the ARC protection fell. By 2018 and 2019, price projections were around the level that we were right at PLC triggers. And in fact, more than half of Nebraska soybean base acres switched to PLC. We didn't actually trigger PLC payments in soybeans. Prices have gone back up in recent years to the point that PLC and ARC neither one are paying. We have shifted back toward ARC in terms of enrollment in Nebraska, 72% in 2023. But again, where will we be in 2024 as both ARC and PLC protection effectively get higher? And then there's the story of wheat. And frankly, PLC has always dominated wheat. Wheat prices never had quite the rally relative to underlying protection levels that the other commodities did. And there's always been perhaps a preponderance towards PLC. Somewhat split in 2014, overwhelmingly PLC in 2019, remaining predominantly PLC in 2023, and questions for 2024 as as at least the prices, the protection between the two looks much closer to each other. Now that's a graph that explains where we've gone and what 2024 might look like at the moment. Here's the math specifically. If the effective reference price for corn for 2024 is 401, and that means the effective ARC price weights out in my formula to 417, then we can calculate how big a loss it would take to trigger potential payments under either program. For PLC, it would take a 10% price loss from current projections. That's a 447 projection for the national marketing or average price for the 24 crop. It's too early to forecast. It's too early to be confident in that number. That's a baseline projection that was calculated this past fall, effectively for planning and analysis purposes. But if the projection is somewhere in that neighborhood, it's going to take about a 10% price loss before we trigger PLC. If the projection's in that neighborhood for price, it would take a 7% revenue loss from either price losses below that level or some yield loss below benchmark to trigger ARC. In other words, ARC may trigger first, given current projections, given expectations for 2024. That's also true for grain sorghum. It would take about a 6% price loss from current projections to trigger PLC. ARC is effectively at the money today. The 431 projected price is the same 431 effective ARC price in the calculation that I have, which says that ARC would actually cover any sort of combination of price losses or yield losses below current expectations. Soybeans, 15% price loss, 13% revenue loss. Wheat, 13% price loss, 16% revenue loss. There too remains where wheat still perhaps relies more on the price safety net as it has over time. Let me illustrate one more way to think about how these payments actually work. If I build a table of yield scenarios and price scenarios, and I start at the 447 price scenario here in the middle, and I start with 140 bushel corn yield in this case, this is a simple average of the benchmark corn yields across all of the counties in Nebraska. It's not a weighted average. It's not a state level average. It's just a very simple average across counties for purposes of illustration. If you meet 140 bushel corn and a 447 price as projected, you're going to end up with a $0 ARC payment because you've met revenue expectations. If you fall below those with some sort of yield loss or price loss, you get to the point where you trigger ARC, and you get to the point where you trigger bigger and bigger ARC payments. You'll see that there's sort of a contour forming there as soon as you have a price and yield loss. You'll note the table here is sort of built on a 10% loss, a 20% loss, a 30% loss, etc. You will also note with ARC that I reach this number of 6790 and it just sticks. That's because ARC protects losses below the benchmark or below the guarantee, but it only protects the first 10% of the benchmark, and then it caps out. So it makes payments early. It makes payments perhaps quicker than PLC. It may respond quicker to those shallow revenue losses, but it also caps out. It's not the coverage that carries you all the way to the floor. It relies on you having some risk management plan that might include crop insurance or other things along the way. That's what an ARC table looks like. Here's a PLC table. And the first thing to note is there is no variance across yield. PLC does not care about yield ranges or yield outcomes. PLC only is affected by the price outcome, the national marketing or average price, and it pays if that falls below the effective reference price. So 447 is expected, 402, that would be a 10% loss. That's just out of the money. 401 is where it would start to kick in. So at 358, you see substantial payments, a substantial payment rate. Now I've calculated if 140 bushel is my expected yield, I've calculated a 112 bushel payment yield. And to do that, I've made a very straightforward assumption that payment yields are in fact, on average, around 80% of current expected yields. We could debate that number, but fundamentally, there's a substantial discount between expected yields and payment yields, which reflects some historical yields on the operation. But suffice to say, if prices go down, which is up in this table, but if prices go lower, PLC payment rates get bigger and bigger and bigger. All the way down to if prices fell below 220, that's the loan rate, PLC payments would max out. And then you'd have the marketing loan to cover additional losses. So payments get bigger. Payments could be very big per acre. This is a payment rate calculation only. You multiply that by 85% of base acres to figure out a payment, and then recognize that that payment is subject to payment limits and payment eligibility rules and so forth. So it may not be that every dollar of this potential payment rate is received, but fundamentally recognize that the programs work in different ways. To compare the two, I took the ARC payment rate minus the PLC payment rate. And there's about 3 places here where we recognize that there are differences. If prices go down and they go down sharply, PLC pays more. ARC minus PLC ends up a negative number because PLC pays more. PLC, once it starts to pay, pays deeper and deeper and deeper. ARC caps out. PLC also pays even when there's not a yield loss. So regardless of yield, PLC pays. ARC would kick out because yield helps overcome lower prices. So there's a band where PLC dominates ARC. If you truly believe that there are yield losses and that there's a potential for sharply lower prices. There's also a region over here where ARC dominates PLC. When you have shallow price losses, or when you have sharp yield losses, even under higher prices, you end up in an area where revenue falls and ARC pays, even when PLC doesn't. And so there's an area where ARC dominates the outcome of lower yields under modest to higher prices. There's an area where ARC dominates. There's an area where PLC dominates under sharply lower prices. And then there's the whole area, if you look to the bottom and to the right side of the chart, where neither one pays. That's the area of moderate to higher yields, moderate to higher prices. Revenues are up, prices are up. Neither program would be expected to pay. That's not a bad outcome. Just to remind, this is a table of payments. This is not a table of net revenue on the farm. That's the preferable outcome. Payments are for trying to make up some of those shortfalls. So that's how these programs might work. I do make mention of ARC IC. We've already covered it. Dillon has covered it in some detail, so we'll leave it at that. ARC IC is an option, and there is a question before us about whether it's a common choice. The answer is it's not common. There are occasions where ARC IC worked, particularly in 2019 and 2020. But in a typical year, when you're making a decision ahead of planting time, you're projecting, and ARC IC fits better perhaps on an operation where there are a limited number of crops, or where there are some maybe some different histories and diversification at play. But that's ARC IC just in mention here. To sum this up, and I know I'm pushing the time limits here too to answer questions, but if we fundamentally think about ARC protects us when revenue losses occur from either yield and or price losses. It only does protect shallow losses. It kicks in at 86%. It caps out at 76%. So it doesn't pay everything. It fundamentally expects or builds on the fact that you might have a crop insurance protection plan below that. PLC provides price protection, nothing related to yield. It provides price protection that kicks in when prices fall below the effective reference price. It kicks in and gets bigger and bigger as prices may go deeper and deeper. So PLC might fit in very well if you're fundamentally worried about price risk and not yield risk. PLC might fit in if you're coupling your farm program decision with a crop insurance decision, particularly something called the supplemental coverage option, which is a supplemental county-based policy that you might choose to stack on top of your individual policies. SCO is available if you're enrolled in PLC or if you're not in the program. SCO is not available if you're enrolled in ARC. And the argument is that SCO and ARC look an awful lot alike. SCO kicks in from 86% down to whatever coverage you buy. ARC kicks in at 86% down to 76%. So they kind of look alike, except that they're not really the same. SCO is tied to the insurance price, which is this year's futures-based forecast price. ARC is tied to this 5-year Olympic average. They might be relatively equal. They might be out of step one way or the other. And that means that they don't really cover the same band, even when it says the same percentage level. So maybe SCO provides protection that ARC doesn't provide. Maybe ARC provides better protection. That depends on a year-to-year analysis. Whether you might choose ARC or PLC might really be a decision of, do you want to choose ARC or do you want to choose PLC plus SCO? And that's an individual producer decision. Where SCO might help is if it helps you cover a band that isn't covered by your individual policy, or it isn't covered effectively by ARC. Is SCO worth it? Well, SCO is an insurance policy. You buy it from an insurance agent at a cost, but it is also federally supported, which means that there's a federal subsidy in the premium, and the producer paid premium is not the total. And thus, over time, in fact, expectations are that you return more in indemnities than you pay in farmer paid premiums. So maybe SCO is worth it over time, and maybe that does affect your decision. To date, SCO has been relatively small in terms of participation in Nebraska, maybe 4% enrolled last year on the major crops. So it's not a big factor yet, or not a big factor at the moment. It is a factor that could affect your decision making. Now, we've had all this discussion about what we know about ARC and PLC and what the decision for 2024 might be. There is the opportunity for more education to come. And Nebraska Extension and the Nebraska Farm Service Agency offices are collaborating together on education. You'll see 20 meetings scheduled across the state. We have 2 meetings scheduled in Wayne, an afternoon and an evening meeting. So that's the 19 locations, 20 meetings. You can find one that's somewhere in your proximity if you're interested in attending an in-person meeting. You can also find this info at cap.unl.edu for further information. So I'll stop with that in terms of what I'm sharing here. I have pushed longer into the presentation here, so let me first stop. And I want to call Dillon back, and I'll include Bobby Chris Wickham from FSA to join us as well. We have just about hit our time, but I'm going to ask a couple questions, Dillon, if you'd provide some clarification here.
Okay.
A question that we've had coming into the meeting was, what does a landlord need to sign, and when do they need to sign? And particularly take the case of crop share. Landlord's a participant, what do they need to do? Cash rent, landlord doesn't technically receive the crop or the payment, what do they need to do?
Okay, so I'll kind of address both scenarios here. So I'll start with a landlord who doesn't have a share of the crop or doesn't have a risk in the commodities planted on the farm. They are not required to sign the election or the enrollment for 2024. So the operator or the tenant would be required to sign the ARC PLC contract to either to make a new election or to simply enroll the farm into ARC PLC by the March 15th deadline. Now, for a landlord who does have a risk in control, or does have a risk in a crop, or has a share of the commodities planted on the farm, they also need to sign the ARC PLC contract for whatever election they choose to enroll in. I know I kind of talked about this a little bit in the training, but in that example, both the landlord and the operator or tenant both have to unanimously agree on the election for 2024. So, in one situation, we're not requiring the landlord to sign the RPLC contract, specifically if they don't have a share of the commodities. On the other hand, where we have a share rent agreement on a farm, both individuals or if it's a legal entity, they would be required to sign the RPLC contract.
Thank you, Dillon. The other question, I mentioned it briefly in passing in mine, but you talked about ARC IC. I mentioned it very briefly. Is ARC IC a common choice? And can we discuss a bit, when does it matter? When might it be helpful, and why?
So I'm going to kind of go back to my county office experience. Just my experience, I was a CED in the field for 6.5, 7 years. In my discussion with producers, revolving around ARC IC, the ultimate, in almost every situation, the ultimate factor was, well, ARC IC only pays on 65% of the base acres on the farm. That normally stopped the conversation right there, and producers typically looked at the other two options of PLC or ARC County. There are there could be certain situations, like you mentioned there towards the end of your presentation, where an ARC IC election may be a better option for you. But again, there's a lot of information that FSA needs with ARC IC, to establish the benchmark revenues for, the crops that are going to get planted for 2024. For example, if we have a farm that's enrolled in ARC IC for 2024, and, corn was the covered commodity planted on the farm, we would need to establish a benchmark period of the corn that was produced on that farm in the prior years. So there's a little bit more work, from a producer's aspect, and also an FSA aspect as well, that involves ARC IC. But primarily the 65% base acres compared to the 85% with ARC County and PLC, that was a big determining factor for ARC IC.
That's a big number that shows up. I would offer just a historical perspective of ARC IC was introduced in 2014, just as ARC and PLC, ARC County and PLC were. The argument at the time, or the push for it at the time, was ARC County will be a county-based guarantee number. In some very big counties, a county-based guarantee may not be a very effective sort of match for what you actually experience on the farm. And so the idea of an individual coverage meant that maybe your protection is better defined by what really happens on the farm. Theoretically, farm variance is greater than county variance, which means it might trigger more often. Thus, it might trigger more, but the payment factor means it will pay a smaller factor. Maybe that balances out.
I will add one more additional comment, Brad. Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you, but I just want to make sure it's clear for everyone that's on the call. If you're a producer that has multiple farms, you're not required to enroll all of your farms in ARC IC. If you want to, let's say you have 5 farms, you're allowed to enroll one of those farms in ARC IC, and the rest, the other 4 remaining farms, you can elect and enroll how you choose to do so. But I just wanted to make that kind of make that aware to everybody.
Great. You bet. Important to note. ARC County versus PLC is crop by crop on each farm. ARC IC takes all crops on the farm, but it is still farm by farm, as you know. So good distinction. ARC IC was more popular in 2019 and 2020. ARC IC helped protect farms that were struggling with flooding or prevent planting, which meant there were some total revenue losses, and ARC IC certainly kicked in on those. So there are times and places where it makes some sense and some value. In a forward-looking decision here, before we know what the crop year looks like, it's difficult to know for sure when it might fit. But for certain operations, having a farm level guarantee looks better or may work better than not. There was a question about, I believe, options for farms with no base acres.
That's an interesting question. I think, Kathy, if you wouldn't mind jumping on, I think I'll defer that question to you if that's okay.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Kathy Anderson. I'm a production and compliance program chief at the Nebraska Farm Service Agency. I work with Dillon. Essentially, ARC and PLC both drive off of a farm having available base acres, and base acres are based on sort of historical plantings. And as we have Farm Bill legislation and as that comes along, that tells us whether or not we have new authority to establish new base acres. So if you have a farm that currently does not have base acres available, ARC and PLC really would not be options as far as our commodity-based programs. We have several other programs through FSA that might be able to assist you. But from our commodity, our safety net programs, those base acres are sort of a key component.
Mm-hmm. So that's something that awaits Farm Bill action if and when it occurs, if and when some sort of base acreage update may or may not be included.
Right.
That does not having base acres does not prevent you from participating in crop insurance.
Correct.
So those are certainly options and tools to look at. Of course, participating in crop insurance means you do face the same conservation compliance rules that you face if you did participate in commodity programs. So there are benefits available, protection available. There are compliance rules that go with that.
Right. And many other FSA programs that could apply as well.
You bet. One more question one more issue I would like to mention here before we close. And with Dillon on, we thank you for your insight, and Kathy as well. Bobby was on momentarily. Bobby Chris Wickham is the communications person at FSA. And there she's back. I see her now. It's worth mentioning, even as FSA has the challenge of trying to run everybody through commodity program election decisions and enrollment by March 15th, they're also rolling out substantial other programs, ongoing conservation and other programs, but also now some rather important disaster assistance programs. And so I want Bobby to, if you will, to mention those and just remind us of that activity going on, and maybe worthy of another discussion at another time.
Sure. Thanks a lot, Brad, for allowing us the opportunity to just briefly mention some upcoming deadlines and some programs that are in addition to what we're talking about here with ARC and PLC. So for producers, especially folks with livestock who maybe have impacts in 2023 with the drought, application deadline for programs that would help with grazing loss assistance, maybe cost of hauling feed above normal or hauling water above normal. Those programs, the Livestock Forage Disaster Program and the Emergency Livestock Assistance Program, have a deadline of January 30th, 2024 for those 2023 impacts. So if you are in a drought area, had impacts, and haven't talked to your county office yet, you should do so as soon as possible. For both of those programs, you have to have risk in both the livestock and the grazing. So that's important to note as well. And then with the winter weather, extreme winter weather that we had earlier, late in December, early January. I mean, things are a little better right now, but it wasn't that far along back that we were, extreme cold and snow and winds. We do have several programs that we are implementing in those areas that were very hard hit or will be implementing potentially. So producers who had impacts from now severe winter storms should contact their county office. Programs like the Livestock Indemnity Program, if you lost livestock, may kick in. We have a new provision with an emergency conservation program for snow removal. Although that program has to be implemented at the local level first. So lots of things going on. Contact your county office sooner rather than later if you had impacts and want to inquire about those programs.
Thank you, Bobby, and appreciate you mentioning those other activities and efforts as well. Always a busy time period, and certainly with a multitude of programs to implement simultaneously. As I close here, I want to thank each of you. Dillon, thank you for your presentation and your expertise. Kathy, for your additional insight, and Bobby, for your work and collaboration on all of this. This is part of the Nebraska Extension and Nebraska Farm Service Agency collaboration that's been continuing for many years, and will continue, as I noted, with a series of meetings across the state here in February. Some of them coming up, the first one's coming up already on February 6th. So not very far away. I want to thank all of you for joining us today. Thanks to those who are participated and even hung on here past the 1 hour mark to hear the final discussion. Thanks to all. Greatly appreciate your role and your participation. You can, of course, look for a recording of this webinar. If you want to review this and look at something, a recording of this webinar will show up in our Center for Ag Profitability webinar page under our archives. That's cap.unl.edu/webinars. And of course, you can always find out the next webinar and the next series of educational efforts to come. Our Farm Bill education efforts are up there on CAP as well. cap.unl.edu/farm bill takes you to that current list of meetings coming up in February. And there is, in fact, a meeting that CAP is hosting tomorrow. Tomorrow at noon, as noted in the chat box, the Center for Ag Profitability and USDA's Risk Management Agency will host a Zoom session on some of the livestock insurance and livestock assistance programs available from RMA. So continuing big portfolio to cover, continuing efforts to do so. Finally, thank you again, as I said, for your time today. But when you leave, you're going to have an opportunity to see a short survey. Please consider offering your quick responses and feedback on today's webinar, as well as future topics or discussions you'd like to see. And we'll look forward to sharing and addressing those as we can. So thank you very much this afternoon for your time. I wish you all a good afternoon.